Welcome, I'm Jeff Carter. I go by he, him with Seattle CityClub. Welcome to this virtual civic bootcamp on Native American leadership in the Salish Sea region and our second webinar on Native American youth advocacy. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that Seattle CityClub is a small nonprofit with a big mission to strengthen our community through conversations with community leaders on critical topics like this one and encourage civic engagement. So please consider supporting us to continue programs like these by making a donation on our website, seattlecityclub.org. With that, I'd like to open today's webinar by welcoming Rena Priest, Washington State's first Native Poet Laureate, who will offer a land recognition, selected poems, and reflections on her role as the Poet Laureate. Welcome, Rena, and thanks for joining us.
Natsiam, Ohilix and Quinnis and the Tachel, Etiakaias, Sahweltanats and Asnat, Chochlamisan. I'm so pleased to be here with you today. Thank you for that introduction. And I'd like to begin by offering a land acknowledgement, talking a little bit about this beautiful place where we live. So in the straight Salish point of view, interconnections are everywhere, giving additional layers of meaning to all of our interactions. This is a reflection of the many ways nature operates. And I'll give an example of the ways Indigenous people use flowers. In addition to being beautiful, the flowers we prize and cultivate are also useful. Function and elegance are at the heart of our cultural aesthetic. And in the Salish also sources of nourishment, medicine, and warmth. In the dirt below their shining blue blossoms, camas bulbs hold a unique protein-rich carbohydrate that can be roasted and enjoyed immediately or dried and ground down into flour to be added to soups throughout the rainy winter. Of wild sweet roses become rose hips, a source of carotene, vitamin C, and other antioxidants, while radiant fireweed is vivid as well as versatile. Fireweed shoots can be eaten, leaves can be made into tea, roots into medicine, and the downing seeds can be used as a fire starter or woven together with goat wool to make blankets. There are many other examples of beautiful and useful botanicals in our homelands, but my point in examining the multifaceted function of native flora is to draw a comparison to the wisdom shared by our youth. Their vibrant perspectives and visions for the future are of a type that are beautiful to the mind's eye and below the surface are nourishing to the spirit. Some of what they share about the challenges they face may act as bitter medicine. Some of their wisdoms may fill a peculiar emptiness in you that you didn't know was there until you found you were filled up by what you've heard. As you listen to the concerns and the hopes of these young people, please acknowledge how their words are not often given this type of platform. We must seek to create opportunities to amplify their voices so their important and nourishing messages can be heard among the din of voices who've come here to use this land and its riches as a palimpsest. In saying this, I'm making a land acknowledgement. The purpose of a land acknowledgement is to bring to the forefront of your attention a truth that often goes untold, a history that is rarely mentioned. This land was not empty when the first whites arrived. These rivers, headlands, and waterways. For the original inhabitants, this land was a garden, cultivated and cared for, cherished and understood. This land is still loved by the descendants of the people who were forced from their homes and confined to reservations, denied access to their usual and accustomed fishing, hunting, and harvesting areas, denied inherent rights to fulfill spiritual obligations to gather nourishment in accordance with the cycles and rhythms of the seasons, and in accordance with our spiritual laws that ensured the continued prosperity of our camas fields, berry crops, fish runs, fowl flocks, and game. To help us tend to this garden, the ancestors provided intricate instructions which were passed down to young people to carry forward through stories. The stories contain teachings on how to live a beautiful life, how to live in a village alongside other people, how to live alongside the animal people, how to honor the gifts of the forests and the waterways so that they would continue to give their abundance. These stories are technology. A land acknowledgement asks you to ask yourself how you can make room for these stories and for their tellers and for the wisdom of how to care for a garden. So the poem that I'll share with you, actually, I'm going to share just one poem because it's a little bit long, and it's new. It's kind of exciting. It was written for Resources, a fundraiser for a nonprofit here based in Bellingham. And as part of the registration process, they invited registrants to contribute a sentence about why they live here or describe what they love about this region. And there were more than 200 submissions. So I had a lot of fun braiding this poem together from the words of the people who attended that event. And I'd like to share it with you as a tour of the Salish Sea bioregion and why we love it so much. It's called The Source. We are in a beautiful, dynamic, natural world, walking in the sweetness of cedar forests and sea salt-laden mists, nature and souls touching. We are all interconnected. I love the rain, lands, and beautiful waters, orcas and salmon so close to home, the rich Coast Salish culture, native caretakers of the wild flowing integrity of living waters. Nature is all around me, and we are all trying to protect it, to enjoy it, to be renewed, to share it. Abundance, lush life abounds. There is beauty all around. Lummi traditions, roots, Indigenous protectors, intersection of earth allies for all living things. I was born here to so much beauty and vitality, ecotopia, connection, community, the breeze, trees, mountains, streams, the ocean. Love thy nature, lush life, where salt water meets the mountains, soul peace, salmon streams, salt water, and that West Coast vibe. Mountains, rivers, ocean, community, rainforest, sagebrush prairies, our Salish Sea home, nourishes mind, body, and spirit. I love the crackling of arbutus bark as the underside of its leaves catch the play of light with the water. I love the landscape, its majesty, mystery, and magical quality, inspiring us to become a restorer species rather than a consumer species. Lush life, friendliness and greenness, bountiful natural inspiration. Into the forest I go to renew my soul, beauty in every direction. Nettles, thimbleberries, salmonberries, alders, community of people and trees, peace and tranquility of nature. It's my homeland. This is home. Clouds, sunsets, otters chasing cutthroat, while herons stalk whatever they stalk, and the eagle watches it all from above, the natural beauty. It is peaceful, and I love the scenery, sensibility, sensitivity, sanity. I love the air, the water, the people of this beautiful region. Exploring beaches as the tide rises and falls, we can watch the stars in the sea, where moon jellies launch in a wet galaxy. The mountains and sea, all within reach, sea stars and madrona trees, salmon fighting their way upstream to complete the circle of life. Breathing the air, mountain air, fresh air amid the breathtaking beauty of tall trees, old-growth forests, moss-covered limbs, snow-covered mountains, 10,000-foot glacier-covered volcanoes. It's all about the snowy mountains, beautiful rain and sailing seas, gifts of rain and snow, clean air, colors out my window, the grasses, brush and understory, trees small and large, distant lush foothills, blue and white sky. Nature's brilliance, numerous lichens, camas and wildflowers, hands in the dirt, the possibility of regenerative, sustainable agriculture. I cherish living among human, plant, and animal people, the Salish Sea and all its wondrous inhabitants, close and connected, received by spirit of place and all residing beings. This is home. This is beauty, a homecoming. So that was a lot of fun to write, just because I got to, it was kind of like having a dialogue, a little bit being in dialogue with all of the people that would participate in the event in a way, and to be able to share their words. It was really exciting. As poet laureate, I feel like I haven't had a chance in the pandemic yet to interact with with the community in the way that I normally would in this role. And so any opportunity to be able to interact is really nice. So I enjoyed writing that. And I think that I'm just mostly looking forward to hearing from the youth and hearing what they have to share and what they'll say and what we can learn with them.
Thank you, Rena.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Rena. Thank you very much for sharing your poetry. Really appreciate it. And everyone, look for Rena's other speaking engagements. Humanities Washington, and look at their website, and she'll be, I'm sure, speaking a lot more in the next year. So thank you again, Rena. Now I'd like
we're trying to get an algorithm. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
About that. We haven't quite got the algorithm working that announces my events, which is unfortunate because there have been just a ton since April. Almost every day there's something like this going on, but there won't be anything up yet, I think, until probably towards the end of the month. So sorry about that.
No, if people wanted to read more about you, where would they go? Your website, or why don't you just tell us?
Yeah, so there have been numerous interviews done. There's a lot written about me as far as events and how to join and participate. There are social media accounts that we're going to try to update with events in lieu of having the calendar operational on the website. So you can look for Washington State Poet Laureate on Twitter or on Facebook or on Instagram.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'd like to turn now to Owen Oliver, a very recent graduate of University of Washington, as in like 15 minutes ago, right? Or even 10 minutes ago.
Yeah, that about sums it up.
Thank you so much for joining us, Owen. Congratulations again. And I really appreciate your being here. When I asked him what his title was, he said community member, and it goes so much more than that. I'll let you talk to folks about who you are and let you introduce the panelists and go on with the conversation today. So thank you again, Owen.
Thanks, Jeff. Close Kanawe, Owen Nekanim. Hello, everyone. My name's Owen Oliver. I come from the people of the lower Columbia River, the Salish Sea, and the southwest pueblos of Isleta. However, I'm enrolled Quinault. I'm a recent grad about 10 minutes ago from the University of Washington in American Indian Studies and Political Science. I think that's the only time I'll be able to say that, so soak it in now. And I focus on Indigenous education and transforming knowledge systems from our annual canoe journeys and placemaking into empowering Native students to succeed in higher education, whether that's through writing, whether that's through, making videos, whether that's through tons of mediums. So it's kind of culminated into me serving kind of more on a federal level. I serve as the secretary for the Youth Advisory Board for the Center for Native American Youth. I'm housed in Washington, D.C., where we give direct policy recommendations to the administration. One of our policy recommendations was reverting the Tongass National Forest up in Ketchikan, Alaska, to be falling under the 2001 roadless rule. Trump reversed that ruling 3 months before his presidency, and today, Biden reverted that ruling of Trump's. So that just happened this morning. So we're seeing mobilizing happening on the front right now. And it's my honor, to support Native youth and have a Native youth moderator to talk about these issues. It's so important to have youth talk to youth, not the other way around, not adults talking to youth. We just need to have a wonderful youth conversation. So when Jeff asked me on this specific day, 10 minutes after my graduation, I said, of course, I would love to come. And it means so much just to talk to youth and uplift their messages, because I knew I was gifted with that to, be gifted by people to uplift my message. So, giving that back, that's our Coast Salish, traditions. So just wonderful. And we have some wonderful youth here that you guys are just so amazing. And I'm so excited to, have you guys share your stories. So I would love for you guys just, let's just have a casual conversation, no stakes here. But would love for you guys just to introduce yourselves. First, talk about your work and how you got into it. And we could start with Sadie, and we'll go Rosalie, and then Ivy. How about that?
Haishka Kwasomat Sanasna Cha Uchlamisin Sahanap Sana Man Kusamat Sana Tan Sawitsan Ohilok Quinus Asla Atiakaias Nuchchisin Maqualia Quinus Inatachal Nastlit Quinus Qual Aquaquino Squal Out Sen Kachit Sa Uchlamichasin E Utatasin Quinus Twinouts Haishka Atia Skeno Ait Straight. Thank you. My traditional name is Kwasomat and my English name is Sadie Olsen. I am from Lummi and Troy Olsen. Sahanap Hasmin is my father and Shirley Williams Kusamat is my mother. I am happy to see all of you here today. I would just like to say a few words. I love each and every one of you. I don't know the Lummi language and I'm still learning how to speak it. Haishka, thank you for your good work. Your very good work. This is really exciting to be in this circle of people and to be speaking to the Seattle CityClub for the Civic Boot Camp. I have been asked to speak about promoting cultural revitalization and Native-led environmental education, which is what I do through my family's Native-led nonprofit organization called White Swan Environmental. So I just want to share my screen soon after I talk about how I got started, because that was the first question. Basically, I've been born into the Swan family and I learned the Swan family songs and I participated in our cultural events and our song and dance events. And that's just something that always stuck with me. I'm really passionate about singing and people would ask me to sing for them for different types of events. And it really opened up my eyes to the power of music and how my song or my voice is what our late hereditary chief CM Salik, Bill James, he said, my voice is slang out, which is the Wuklamitasan word for medicine. And that really stuck with me because when people are hurting and in times of hurt for Native peoples, which I help educate people about the history of the Native relations and of our Native relations and the federal government and the different branches of the government, because there's the federal government, which is really cool that you work on, Owen, and there's the state government, and then there's the local government, so based on counties, and then there's the tribal governments. And the tribal governments tend to have relationships directly with the federal government due to treaties, and treaties are the superseding law of the land. So it's really important for people to be aware of our treaty rights so that we can uphold those rights and protect what our ancestors made sure were in our treaties for future generations. And now that they're gone and we're learning about those rights that we have, it's really important for us to make sure that we still sustain those rights and pass them on to future generations. And we used to be 100% of the population and we're 1% now. So when I think about the Native community and I'm participating in health policy and procedures that I can, with the different roles that I have in the community, I do tend to think of song as medicine, and I open up the floor in a grounding ceremony for opening up with the Swan family song. Like I was able to speak, or I was able to sing for the ceremony for my Auntie Rena who was accepted as the first Native Washington State Poet Laureate. And that was amazing. And I just feel like it's a really connective thing, and it's a practice that our ancestors would have done. And I'm really passionate about the environment, and I love plants, and I learned that plants are really important for us. So that's something that I try to advocate for. And I wrote a song when I was 8 years old about how it's important to protect Mother Earth. And I worked on it with my cousin. So that was a really fun experience. And I think that's how we got started. Like I said, I want to show you guys our website. So I'm just going to show you that really quickly. We have been working on our nonprofit organization since 2018. So this is an example of some of the work that we do. Here we are standing in Papiawas, Sleslinquit, Henry Island, and this is where my father brought out the reef net, and these youth gathered to pray on our waters and pray for our fishermen, and to bring out the reef net, which has been outlawed for Native use for plenty of years. So we had intergenerational community members there, from elders to youth, and it was just amazing to be able to bring out our canoes and practice in our homelands again. And you can see just the joy in the community where we were practicing. So that's on our website. You can go and look at that. I'm going to pause it here and explain to you our mission for White Swan Environmental. We One Mind for the purpose of the work. Our mission is to support community healing through the natural, cultural, and historical restoration to the Salish Sea for 7th generation sustainability as a measure of ecological health protection for all. And our vision is, we are the vision keepers for a Coast Salish Tribal Heritage Field Institute, an Indigenous-led 13-moon, mountain to sea, reef to reef, K through PhD program with 7 longhouses in the San Juan Islands and 7 longhouses in the Gulf Islands. This mission and vision is really important because it was created by our White Swan Environmental Board, as well as the National Park Service and the National Land Bank. So all of these leaders came together to help us really dive into the scope of our work and focus on what it is that White Swan Environmental wants to do and what we're advocating for. So I'm asking for donations. Please donate if you can to help us support our vision. But otherwise, we have a lot of different activities that we do through our nonprofit organization. So I want to share with you under the Cultural Preservation tab, we have the Spirit of Shwala SOS Coalition. And these are the projects that we have going. So the Spirit of the Shwala SOS Coalition is made of Indigenous leaders, 100% Indigenous leadership from the United States side in Lummi, and as well as our relatives in Canada. And we have the SOS Stewardship Corps, which has been a really great program to get Indigenous youth out into our homeland, which is the San Juan Islands and the Gulf Islands and the mainland. But I would really like to recognize our homelands as the San Juan Islands and the Gulf Islands. And for the Slackdamish people or the Lummi people, Orcas Island is our Alalung, and that's where our origin story connects us to. Our next project is Indigenous Public Health, and that's a really interesting project with Rachel Flynn, who's helping us to understand the physiological symptoms of historical trauma on Coast Salish communities, specifically the reef netting communities. So we're going to be, we'll get into that eventually. It's going to be very cool. The digital eco-cultural mapping project is going to be a really beautiful map to help people learn about the different types of ecosystems in our environment, because we're a very interesting microclimate here. As Rena's beautiful poem mentioned, we have mountains and we have seas and we have reefs and we have all different types of life forms inside of each different ecosystem. And most prominently, our salmon they have been our staple food in our diet for a very long time, since time immemorial. And the headwaters of the river is the mountain and the snowpack. So we really cherish our mountain and our rivers and where the water comes out in the delta. We're working on a 13 Moons food sovereignty project with the White Swan environmental interns from Northwest Indian College and Western Washington University. And we're working on field to classroom programs and curriculum to help get the information out to the community and the different generations, such as the Truth and Reconciliation information from Western. And then we're also we're co-founders of Whatcom Intergenerational High School. I was recently given an award for the 30 under 30 changemakers from the National Alliance of Public Charter Schools, which was amazing. I got an award as a social justice recognition, and that's just so powerful and honorable. I'm just like thankful. I'm honored that people see me as a change maker and see me as a social justice advocate, because I care for the people in my community and I care for the land that I live on, and I want to pass on those values for future generations. Alongside my family, everything that I learn is from my family and from my elders. So I'm really thankful and grateful for all of the passing of wisdom. And then legislative advocacy. So Indigenous Truth Washington is a petition that you're free to sign, and it helps us to move truth and reconciliation into Washington State. And our last project is the Longhouse Restoration, which is where we would want to have WIHS or our longhouses for our K through PhD curriculum in the long run. And longhouses are really significant in our culture because they were places where our Coast Salish relatives would have gathered in the wintertime to share wealth and resources. So Owen mentioned that it's one of the values of the Coast Salish people to give back. So oftentimes people would live in different regions in their environment, and then they would gather from those regions and they would pass on their resources of wealth that they gathered from those regions. And then they would bring them together in the wintertime, and everybody would be around a warm fire, and they would share songs and they would share dances and they would share prayers, and they would also share their food wealth. And that's kind of where we want to see our children in the future. And that's also where a lot of transmission of knowledge would happen, because we're intergenerational people and oral storytellers. So a lot of wisdom is shared in stories around the fire, and we share so much with each other that connects us to our land and connects us to our community members inside the Longhouse. So I'm really excited to see the Longhouse restoration, and it's already happening on the Canadian side and in New Zealand, which is really amazing. Haishka, for the opportunity to speak. I'm really grateful and honored to be here. And I also want to invite you, lastly, so if you go to newsletters and events on whiteswanenvironmental.org, it's a .org site, pretty cool. Then you can click on current events. And I want to invite you to our event that's happening tomorrow at 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. They're really quick learning activities so that we can help gather for the Visions for the Future, a conversation among Indigenous youth. And we run through the design clinic, which has been formulated by the Western Washington University. And they do a design clinic to help people bring in community members, express a problem, get community support, run through 3 different steps to really hone in on what the problem is and what they've dealt with and how they can offer solutions, and just a language to do that in a non-confrontational way. And then the person is able to react on that. And that's almost the whole hour. So you get to meet cool people and help each other out. And our recent art was made by Sophia Jackson, a wee intern. Haishka.
Haishka, Sadie, and thank you for that wonderful presentation. We'll have to unpack it throughout this hour. I think that was a lot of information for a lot of people, just, but listening to it is wonderful, and hearing just the strides that Lummi Nation is, taking to ensure that, sovereignty and protection of cultural values. So Haishka, my hands go up to you. Rosalie, would you like to briefly introduce yourself and the work you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Oyats esketchat Rosalie Fish Seatsta Buckleshoot Abshed. Hello, my name's Rosalie Fish. I'm 20 years old. I'm from the Muckleshoot lands, and I'm enrolled in the Cowlitz tribes. My siblings are Puyallup, and my mother is Yakima. And I'm very honored to be a part of the Washington tribe community, as each tribe year has impacted my life in very important ways and has made me into who I am. I am an athletic advocate for missing and murdered Indigenous women. I use my platform as a runner to raise awareness towards the MMIW crisis, specifically to non-Native communities who have no idea that this has been happening to us. With that, I also make it an effort to create intersectional types of activism and to help others find ways to advocate for the issues that they care about using their own individual and unique platforms. And so while I might choose athletics, another Native youth might choose dance or art or music or environmentalism. And so these are the kind of things that I like to do now, is not only raise awareness for missing and murdered Indigenous women, but also to empower other Native youth who might be going through struggles and intergenerational trauma to find their unique forms of empowerment. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosalie. That just amazing intersectionality we'll get into. Ivy, could you introduce yourself next?
Of course. Manahu pesa amamua inaniane Ivy. Noya apoy numu puama abe pai hunadu. Hello, everyone. I am Ivy Pete. I am Paiute of Northern Nevada. My family resides in the Bridgeport colony and alongside Pyramid Lake. I recently turned 17. I'm a junior at North Central High School here in Spokane, Washington. So over on the other side of the mountains. And I was so grateful to be asked to join tonight for my work around the mascot movement, the movement away from the use of Indian mascots, specifically in public schools. So I kind of began my journey in this process as a freshman. My high school used the Indian mascot, and we no longer use that anymore, as we've engaged in this lengthy process that kind of came to fruition both in the district level. Spokane Public Schools is the 4th largest district in the state. And then I was able to write a bill that went to the Representative Deb Lakanoff's office, and that ended up passing in the House and the Senate. From there, we've been doing a lot of work with Indian education departments, both in Washington, at my home, down in Northern Nevada, as well as Arizona, and in some parts of Southern Canada. So all around there. And my big mission has been just not only to redefine this identity as an urban Indian. I think this is something we see a disconnect in, and that's part of the reason we see so much erasure and struggle with our Native communities, is we don't all have a certain look. And so as we talk about losing culture and language and land and, you know, even family since colonization. It's this perpetual dehumanizing image that casts aside the struggles of local Indigenous people and young students, that mythologizes our culture and our lived experience. And if you've heard me speak before, I say it all the time: just because we don't look like this one image that is perpetuated by a Eurocentric standard does not make us any less Indigenous. And this is something I've been working for a very long time, 17 now. But, you know, as I was a young kid, I had to kind of discover and rediscover myself, that as I struggle to identify as Native, both because of my skin color or where I live, you know, where my family is and how much language I know, it's all caused by these same roots of erasure that these images were designed to perpetuate. And the concept of Indian as this one size fits all was not designed by another Indian. It was designed by those aiming to oppress and homogenize us. And so as we work through these struggles, as we work to move away from these images, we remember that it's not on a student or a group of students to carry the burden of representing an entire culture or race on their backs, because the system is not accurately or respectfully educating for them. And so that's been a major player in my work, is painting a new picture of these mascots, which should not be mascots at all. They're not real humans. They're not a group of humans. They're not a culture. It's this selection of preconceived notions and ideas that we set straight. And by setting them straight, we work against these systems of oppression that are harming our youth. They are harming our culture. They're harming, you know, our identities itself. And so even moving forward, we talk about chronic absenteeism, and we can talk about suicide rates and mental health and all of these other things, as Rosalie mentioned. So starting with identity and moving from there, and making sure that we can foster our youth in any form they come to us. Mana hobu.
Thank you, Ivy. And it just, those introductions, wonderful, and just the, you know, intersectionality of everything that you guys do and everything you guys do for your community really shows how Indigenous people carry, you know, these knowledge systems on their backs, and especially the youth are the future. So I kind of want to dive into that, and especially as Ivy, you were talking about identity. And when choosing, you know, you could choose anything to work on as Indigenous people, but specifically choosing on your guys's, you know, topics, how did you get, you know, inspired to do that, or that call for a need that you needed to do that? Maybe could you tell us a little bit more about how that played out, especially in the mascots, Ivy?
Yeah, I'm willing to begin. So in the center of my high school's office, it's this glass case, and it's caging these two presumably Indian mannequins dressed in full regalia. And I think to a lot of people, they believe they honor our culture. But to me, they're symbolic of this defeated and extinct Native American, almost akin to animals in a zoo. And so this is something that I tried so hard to hit home, even as a little freshman. You know, we talk about our education system as slowly diversifying. And I began just by starting these conversations as a young person. I don't think any single student body or staff in an educational setting intends harm, but harm was being done and is being done, and we are not being listened to. And so for me, it started with this realization that our tribal communities and our educational systems don't have that connection that they should and need to have. And so as youth, I think we are in this special place now where we're not necessarily, for me anyway, I don't live on my reservation. So for me, I have to think about presenting myself as a member of my family and my culture and a representative of that, but also remember I'm in a completely different setting than my grandmother was, my great-grandmother was. And I think in the mascot movement specifically, the context has changed so much because they came about after the Indian Wars as a way to memorialize this history as our tribes and our cultures were dying off. And so my grandmother and my great-grandmother feel comfortable with these ideas. They think they're honoring and they think they're respectful, or maybe they just have some sort of connection to them. And so for me, I started by having these connections both with my community and conversations with my family, saying, me in the public school system today, it's not doing the same thing. It's harming me. And I know, and that's another thing. Even culturally, in my culture, you don't speak up to your elders. I think everybody here, you could think about that when you go up to grandma, she would hit you, but yeah, so just being able to recognize that my experience as a public school student and urban Indian is way different than any of my family, and having to begin those courageous conversations as the young people to say, harm is being done to me, but I can't imagine those who don't have a voice, who don't have the same privilege and opportunity to share that I do. And so that's kind of how I began.
Thank you, Ivy. I think is such foundational work, and that will carry your tribe into so many different directions. Thank you for sharing that. Rosalie, could you talk a little bit about how this all started, and the same question. Feel free to take it any way you would like.
Yeah, how I decided to kind of focus in, you could say, on missing and murdered Indigenous women and, being an athletic advocate was really understanding who I am and accepting and acknowledging that and centering my work around who I am. And so for me, something that really impacted me as I was younger and, as a victim of violence is the missing and murdered Indigenous woman crisis. Not only am I as a person, but my entire family are survivors of cycles of violence. And so when I saw an opportunity to raise awareness towards missing and murdered Indigenous women, it felt like it wasn't even a choice. Like it was my responsibility. And so Jordan Marie Daniel, who's a Lakota runner from who originally ran in the Boston Marathon in 2019, she ran with the red handprint painted over her face, along with the MMIW in red down her leg. And she ran that with that paint in order to raise awareness. And when I saw Jordan, it really clicked something inside of me. Like I could feel her looking at me, acknowledging me and seeing me. And so with that, I found her contact information and I just told her, like, you made me feel so empowered. I know you don't know me. I know you didn't really make that for me, but you've done so much for me. And I asked her permission to follow in her footsteps because I wanted to do the same for other Native youth who felt like they needed to be seen. And since I was the only runner on my team, since just our Coast Salish ways, we had the oceans, we had the rivers. Running isn't quite our traditional thing. So I felt a little bit isolated as a Coast Salish runner. And so to be seen by another Native runner, it just felt extremely validating. And so with that, she gave me her permission, and now she's like my older sister and we work together on things. And I began to realize that my identity as a runner, my identity as an Indigenous person, my identity as a sister, as even my identity as someone who has Indigenous people that I love. It felt like it was my responsibility to address this crisis. And when I had my Washington State track and field, my big championship meet, I saw an opportunity to get on the podium a few times, and I saw an opportunity for people to notice me. And I decided I didn't want them to notice me. I wanted them to notice missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so that's how I came to come across my form of activism. And now I'm going to run for the University of Washington. So that's going to be really exciting. And it's a conversation I had with my coach. I told her that I've discovered my identity as an activist, as a runner, as an Indigenous person, and they are not separable. They are all me. And you can never take the fact that I'm an advocate for missing and murdered Indigenous women from Rosalie the runner. They are not separate anymore. And I found a coach who at the University of Washington will support me and will advocate for me and fight with me for my right to raise awareness and create visibility for this crisis that has impacted me since childhood. And so I think the biggest thing when it came to my identity was acknowledging my struggles and acknowledging my resilience and acknowledging that there's so many other Native youth who have the same struggles as me, and we can awaken each other's resilience, just as what happened to me. And so I would love to be the person that I needed 5 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for sharing that initial, contact of storytelling with Jordan and just wanting to know that representation and asking for permission. That's what we do as Indigenous people, is that we have to ask first and we have to bring people in before we give out. So thank you and congratulations on running for UW in the future. There's so many people already at UW who are proud of you and just can't wait to see you run. Sadie, could you talk a little bit kind of about identity and how that has brought your work to the forefront? How have you used your identity to really gain a footing in Lummi and outside of Lummi?
So I do my best to always introduce myself in my traditional language and to share my ancestry. So I also want to share with you all that we remember our ancestors who fought for our sacred trust responsibilities, our gifts from the Creator. My descendancy comes from the Duwamish territory. My grandfather, Dr. Joseph James, was nephew to Chief Seattle. My grandfathers, Peter James, who was born at the fork of the Duwamish River, and George James were instrumental in the development of the Duwamish Tribal Council from 1914 to 1916. My grandfathers tried to get the federal government to uphold their sacred responsibilities, but capitalism won over and our maternal and paternal lineages were forced to federally reserved lands and thrown into poverty and now a global pandemic due to the destruction of our environment. On my father's side, my grandpa Herman was a reef net fisher, and it's been really nice it's just been really empowering to read about how he was a reef net fisher and how he fished on Lummi Island in the bay, in Multnomah Bay. And knowing some of that history that connects us to our place, it's really what drives me to keep going, because I know that my ancestors wanted me to share wisdom that they have, and nobody else has the same wisdom that I have in the same way that I do. And that's the same for every single person in this space. You have your own unique wisdom that nobody else could share. So finding that individuality, but also like connecting it to the collective is really important. I use my voice as an educator because ever since I was young, I've always been, I guess I used to go around the preschool classroom and I would like try to help other students write their names, and I would try to help them like figure out how to, do the letter S and do the letter A and help them make it through their alphabet. And I just loved to read ever since I was really little. But when I went into third grade, my best friend Shoshana and I, Shoshana's the Squamish princess from Lummi right now, and we were both testing into the Aiming High program because I guess we just read so much as little kids that we showed up to school and we had really high test scores. So we ended up in the Aiming High program because we went through a rigorous program, placement testing, and there was like 2 different cycles that you had to go through. Like there was the first test that was just about like if you test on maths, reading, writing, and science. And then the second test was on creativity. So if you're able to creatively express, and that test was really fun because we just like decorated a cake. But we had been compared with other students around the county on, if we were creative enough, if we were able to elaborate on the things that we could. And I'm really grateful that I had her with me that whole experience because she's another Native person. And if I didn't have her, I don't think I would have made it through because there was so much, I don't know. We had to go to a different school every Wednesday and try out all of these new learning tactics. They had to teach us how to dance and dance for the 20s and dance for the 30s. And I could just feel in my own spirit that was not the style of dancing that I was used to. I wasn't used to waltzing. I wasn't used to square dancing, and I was not used to learning about non-native culture and accepting it as my own. And I really I did my best to excel in that program. And I just never felt comfortable learning about all of the history and accepting it as my own when I knew that it wasn't. So yeah, I went into that program all the way through 8th grade. And then in 9th grade, my school was teaching me about the Soviet Union and how there was a historical event where, two leaders were going against each other. And there was one who was saying that he would give his whole, it's in the book called Farm Animals or Animal Farm. And we had to sit there every single day and do like our reading at night. And then we did our writing in the morning, but we'd never have discussions about like what that really meant. And so that was way different than my other educational experiences where everything was so hands-on. And basically one leader, he was corrupt and he ended up lying to everybody and saying that he was going to give all the resources and share them equally. And then the other person was like, well, I'm going to get a little bit more, but I'll still give you everything that you need to survive. But just because I'm doing more work, that means that I'm going to need a little bit more. And the people didn't like that. And they ended up choosing the other person, and he was completely corrupt, and he took all the resources and he stole them basically for himself. And he like kicked the humans out of the house, and he like dominated them. And he was a totalitarian government leader, and he turned into a dictator. And that's a really important history to acknowledge, because sometimes we hear things and we think that it's, oh, like this is the brightest thing, but sometimes the more fair things are the right choice. And then comparing that history and how deeply we learned about it, because it took the whole entire year to learn about it. And I was like, well, what about the genocide of Native American peoples? And what about the fact that I'm the only Native person in this classroom alongside my cousin who was still in the honors class, and maybe one or two other kids who made it through the honors course throughout our school. And what about environmental education? Because we did not have farms here like a long time ago. Maybe we had a beautiful garden and we had beautiful trees and we had a beautiful environment, but we're not seeing that right now. And this was at the same time as we were starting out this Spirit of Szkoła coalition and trying to educate people about our homelands and the fact that Lummi people did not always live on the reservation, which was really hard. And it's traumatizing for people because of the different eras of the federal Indian policy and how there was, the actual disease and death of our people, and then the murder, and then going on into the Relocation Act and us being placed on the reservations, and then us being educated through the boarding school era and the trauma. There was different types of abuse. There was physical, sexual, emotional abuse. There was neglect. And all of those factors led to our elders being afraid of sharing the language and sharing the history, because they don't want us to have to deal with that type of pain again. And that's what Siam Salik told me. And he said that it's really important to do this work because our people are sick and we need to heal. So that's the intention, is healing. I have to say, when we go into this work, it's always about healing and trying to learn about the plants that are the medicine, and trying to share about the language which heals our spirit, but also to educate the non-Native community that we live with in our homelands, and being as persuasive as possible, but not offensive in any way, because I value their life as equally as I value my life. And a lot of people, it's hard for me to be in a community sometimes, because all that prejudice, people just want to throw fire back at each other. And like, I've always been in like this peaceful state. When I was 4 years old, people said that I was an old soul. So I think I just came into this world and I was like, okay, I don't want to hurt anybody. I'm sorry, but I don't want to be hurt either. So I'm advocating and trying to be an educator. But the whole time that I've been doing all of this work, I really didn't see myself as an educator. I just saw myself as a person doing the work. And then people started to come to me and say, oh, can you come educate me about Coast Salish history? Can you educate me about what you know so that I can be a better steward of the land? And that's a real honor to have non-Native people who live on our lands want to learn about how my ancestors would have stewarded the land. But I have to be really careful and cautious as a Lummi Nation tribal member so that I'm not giving too much knowledge and allowing people to appropriate what we have and our intellectual property. And then people will say that it's their own. And we've had those types of experiences, or we've seen those types of experiences where non-Native people will go to institutions and they get grants and money, and they get large amounts of money, and they don't focus on the areas that Native people actually need the assistance. They decide where their focus areas are, and then they say that they're going to focus only on that, and then they pay themselves. And that's just unequitable. So we really work on supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're working on a cultural safety curriculum so that we can, the CEF, or the Community Engagement Fellows model, has been a really great model of showing people how equitable work looks like, or what equitable work looks like, because we're working together and we're sharing each other's stories and we're sharing our voice and we're sharing solutions with each other. But we're going to give credit where credit is due. We're going to share where we got that knowledge from and what past experiences that we've had. And I hope that I answered the question here.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think it's, that intentionality that we put into everything is so important. And I kind of want to, learn more about that, especially in the mascot era, Ivy. And, working, I'm an urban Native myself, and I went to school with like one other Native person in like high school. And like thinking about doing this work in high school is beyond me, because I didn't have any like support systems like that. Who did you lean on, Ivy? Or like, how were you able to do this to get that House bill all the way through?
Yeah, as I reflect, it's definitely a challenge and amazing because I don't see myself in many realms. And as I'm hearing Sadie talk about her experience and her knowledge about her culture and language, it reminds me of how little I know about my own. I know a lot about the systems that oppress Native people, and I know a lot about why I reside here today. I know my language, and I'm learning more and more about my family every day, but I also have to recognize that I know so little because of a system that wants me to know so little, a system that wants me to forget. And so for me, I think my driving force and the reason that I do embark on this work is because I recognize that it's not any fault of my own that I don't know these things. And it doesn't make me any less Indigenous because of it. And so sort of as we started embarking on this journey, for me, there was no one that I spoke to. There was no one that I really reached out to and said, like, what do I do? It was more building allyship as a community. And that is another area that we work on over here is what do we do in our community when we're so small, when we can't come back to our homelands, to our families and take solitude and regenerate? Who do we go to when we have all of these different communities and affinity groups? When we talk about our Black community in Spokane and our Latino community, how do we come together over a collective shared vision while at the same time experiencing so many different cross-layered, approaches that are working to oppress us. And this disconnect, I think we've all found is the reason we struggle, but it's also by design. And that is, I suppose, my biggest goal is I want somebody to see someone like me and say, you know what? I know this about my family. I know enough, and I know I am Indigenous, and I would like to pursue this. I want to learn more. I want to give back, because that is what we do. We fight for ourselves because no one else has fought for us. And that is sort of how we started, even talking about reclaiming that identity. And from the mascot perspective, we start with this one image, but it also is in our textbooks, it's in our language, it's in our teachers. Who do we see within ourselves? How do we go to the district and say we need more Indigenous leaders and teachers and educators? How do we say I need a new textbook when it says that the buffalo went extinct because they were overhunted? Like, there's just so many barriers, and it's one step at a time, because the system doesn't change overnight. And I think that's another thing I've realized is the voices, right? We center impacted people, and we center those who say are struggling to find a voice. But from there, how do we give them all the resources so that they continue, and that we can uplift their voices, Indigenous voices, despite them feeling so isolated? And isolation is the way that this system silences us. And so once again, I don't necessarily have a person that I see, but I recognize that it's by design. And if we keep pushing, we will find each other. We just have to remember that this isolation is intentional.
Thank you. Rosalie, I want to go to you. And I was really listening to how you were talking and about how you can't replace yourself as, an activist and a runner, that it's together. Like, how has the perception of outside media seen that? As Indigenous people, we see ourselves all as one. We're not walking in two worlds, but outside of it, how are people taking this up?
Yeah, you could definitely say that I've been met with some resistance about that. There are even coaches I've had who want me to separate, Rosalie the athlete and Rosalie the Indigenous person and the activist. It's something that I think, unfortunately, there are those out there, especially in, you could say, Western ideologies, that do not want Indigenous peoples to thrive or to gain visibility. And by seeing Indigenous peoples, despite all odds, we find ways. We become resilient, and we find new pathways unique to us that not only empower ourselves, but each other. And so even when you tell us we're not allowed to speak about this, or when you take us out of school books, we show up on the track. And it's this kind of thing that I've been met with some resistance about, and I've had people tell me to keep politics out of sport. It's not the first time an athlete has been told that. And I think if there is one thing that I have to say about that, it's just that me caring about missing and murdered Indigenous women is not political. It's human. It's my humanity. And as an athlete, I will never stop being human. And so this is kind of some of the reactions I've got, and I've had to absolutely stand my ground, even against coaches and against other college staff, against spectators, against competing athletes. And it's like I'm having to prove myself over and over again that I absolutely deserve a voice. And it can be very challenging to be constantly told, you don't need a voice, you don't deserve this voice, only to have to find that inner strength. And luckily for me, I'm very fortunate to have a community that even when I don't have that inner strength, I have my community right behind me to remind me that you do deserve this platform, that you absolutely need to use your voice for us, for your family, for my siblings. I think one of the most impactful things that anybody has ever said to me is my high school coach. And he was extremely supportive. I was the first person, or he was the first person I told that I said, I think I want to run for missing and murdered Indigenous women. And he told me, that sounds like it's going to be a lot of work. And he said, the first thing I'm going to do is check the rule book and see if there's anything against the rules. And I'm going to have the page spotted where it says it's not against the rules, because I know that's the first thing people are going to do, is they're going to try to silence me. And he knew that as my coach. And by the end of the meet, when I had dedicated 4 races to separate women, in missing and murdered Indigenous women in my community, my heart was heavy, my legs were heavy, I was just exhausted. And at the end of the meet, when I had one more race left, and I felt just completely drained, my coach told me that he knows why I'm running. He knows that I don't care that I'm tired. He knows that it doesn't matter whether or not I want to move my legs, because I will move my legs. And he told me I'm not doing it for the spectators watching. I'm not doing it for the people telling me nice war paint. I'm not doing it for the spectators wearing Trump hats. I'm doing it for my siblings. I'm doing it for his children. I'm doing it for the children that I go to school with, or for the future children. And these are the things that kind of keep me going against that opposing gaze. So yeah, I think it's not something that a lot of people will immediately understand. And it's gotten to the point where even if others refuse to understand or accept who I am, they have no choice but to acknowledge it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And just, sorry,
Oh.
can I tag on?
Yeah, of course. Go.
Thank you, Rosalie, for that. And it just reminded me, I think, as we can even feel so isolated, like you mentioned earlier, in our communities and in our work, we remember that we walk with all the knowledge and history and stories and love from our communities and our families and the people that came before us, blazing these trails that we follow. And so it's even when we are alone, or when we feel that we're representing an entire community, it's our ancestors are walking with us. And that is, I think, so uniquely unique to our communities and unique to Indigenous youth today.
Thank you. Thank you. Rosalie, I also want to ask, just because I want to know how you measure success in this. How do you measure that you're doing the best for your community? How are you seeing that beyond the track?
For me, I think the first time I really took a step back to measure my own success, because the way I've been raised in my little Coast Salish family, Muckleshoot family, is that you never really do kind of take a second to look back. You just keep going, because man, do we have some work to do. And if there's anything I've learned, it's that at 20 years old, I don't know how to stand still, because there's always something to do for our communities. There's always work to be done. And for me, I was always taught that this is the least we can do, is we can just keep moving forward, that we can keep succeeding. And in succeeding for me and in my lineage, it means accepting who I am, validating myself, validating others, because there was a point in time in recent history where my great grandpa, he could not be himself. He didn't know how to accept himself and love himself. And so for success, for me, that's knowing how to love myself. At the age of 14 years old, I had a mental health crisis due to racism and being a victim of violence. And there was a point where I didn't want to be myself anymore. I didn't want to live in a world where I was Rosalie Fish. And so now to be 20 years old and to claim who I am, to claim my name, my lineage, my family, and my identity, that's success. And that's all I want for other Native people as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Ivy, could you tell us a little bit about that success? How do you measure success in that after the House bill that passed through? Congratulations on that. And what's next? How do you see success?
Yeah, I think that's an easier question for me to answer than maybe Rosalie, as we see the policy being passed so quickly, or not quickly, but it was not quick, but we see it happening in our lifetime. I used to measure success by just straight up traction. Like, when I have a news interview and I see that people in the comments saying, "You're not Native," this doesn't matter, you should feel honored, this, that, and the other. And it's so much, and it's so hard to continue and persevere through that. But I see measurements through our community growing. I see people claiming their identity, and I see young people coming to me and saying, you know what, you are right. We need to work together. We need to do this. I see our communities looking to our young people. We are the future tribal leaders. We are the leaders of tomorrow. We are the leaders of today, for goodness sakes. I see, like I said, just so much empowerment of youth and voice and Native voice. In our city, we're embarking on this great process of evaluating names citywide, buildings and schools and streets. And what does that look like to really be empowering this true Native identity, empowering voices that are here and present today, not those of the past, not those who we can tokenize and make say what we'd like to say. So that is how I measure success. When I can feel, I kind of see myself, my identity like ebbs and flows. Sometimes I'm like, dang, I'm really white. Like, this is just how I am. And then other times I feel that I can really embrace my culture, and I go to my family and I can be on the land and I can share that knowledge with them. And so I think growth is our community coming together, but at the same time, it's not as linear as it looks for some other things. Specifically with the mascot issue, of course, we're coming to a place that has been in fruition for generations. 60s, started in the 60s, my mom worked on this issue. 70s, we have community members who are coming out and speaking on what they did 30, 40, 50 years ago. In the 90s, when we had small reformations, now we have state law. We're going to have regional and national law very soon. And that's the end goal, to claim that identity and make sure that every single person can feel that they can just be part of it.
Thank you for sharing that. And it's so important, because you don't know how many people's identities you're changing just by putting this, state bill through. I think if we all grew up without knowing, Native mascots, it would change our lives. So thank you for doing that. And Sadie, I want to ask you the same question. How do you measure success, where you've been saying wonderful things through White Swan Environmental and all these giant projects you have? How do you see success?
Thank you for the question. I see success in our different projects. I feel like it's like a thermometer, and you kind of have like little thermometer bars for the different projects that we have. And then like they each get filled up like 10% or like 5% or even 2%. But that little tiny percentage that goes into each project, it just makes the world of a difference. And it just feels so great to know that people have raised their awareness about that certain issue that we're focusing on, whether it be the 13 Moon food sovereignty curriculum, whether it be the Indigenous public health or truth and reconciliation policies. Like, those things are very broad issues that are on a global scale, and the whole world needs to be aware of some of these things, or even all of these things, because it's a measure of ecological justice or environmental justice when we're aware of the knowledge that Indigenous peoples carry and how deeply that connects to our environment, and the awareness of the biodiversity that runs through each different ecosystem. I think that's just one of the most successful measures that I could ever imagine. I think especially if it's place-based and people are working between generations, that people are allowed to and able to educate other people about that issue, which all of those factors are basically the core principles and pillars of Whatcom Intergenerational High School. So that's a huge success in itself. There's a new school coming to Whatcom County, and that was a 700-page application that we had to go through. That whole process, it took 2 years and we finally did it. So it's worth the effort. I think it's worth reading the books about, and it's worth listening to the elders about to be able to speak to the community that I have here right now. To connect to the youth, I think that would be another really, really successful measure that we're still striving to work on, and still we're really hoping to connect with youth, especially Indigenous youth from this territory, but all around the globe.
Thank you. As we're wrapping up on time, I want to ask one of my favorite questions that I always ask at a panel, and leave some room for people in the questions. If you guys have questions for our wonderful youth leaders, please put them in the comments and chat. But I want to ask Rosalie, and then we'll go to Ivy and then back to Sadie, about why are Indigenous youth so important to these movements? And why do you encourage other Native youth? Why do Native youth have to be at the forefront? One of my favorite questions.
Thank you. I think something that's especially unique to Indigenous communities is, as a people or as an identity, how often we are progressing and changing. And so when you look at the difference between our generation, our younger generation right now, this is something Ivy actually touched on a little bit, is there has been so much progress being made by a small population. And so then there's a little bit of disconnect sometimes, like how younger generations like Ivy and I might say, we don't want any more Native American mascots. But then you look at my grandpa, who is fortunate enough to be able to speak his language without being thrown in jail. And he says, well, who cares about the mascots? I can speak my language, right? And when you look at that kind of there's a little bit of disconnect sometimes with, just because of how much change is constantly being made with all of these Native communities working so hard to continuously find our rights. And so I think that's why Native youth need to be at the forefront, is because each generation is a completely different experience. And so the sooner we can get that new perspective in these movements, I think it creates a new a new perspective and a new solutions on an issue that has been impacting us.
Thank you. Ivy, why are Native youth so important?
Yeah, stop me if I'm overstepping here. I say this all the time and I think it's really funny, but I think Europeans love Band-Aids and Native people are healers. So when we say we want to fix the system, we don't mean put a Band-Aid on it. We mean figure out why we're bleeding, figure out where and how we are harmed, and how do we make it stop. That is what I think Native youth have, and that is what they do. We are weavers, we are the connectors of generations, and that is what we will continue to do. That's how I see myself, and I think that's how most Native youth see themselves. They are the connectors of culture and language and stories. And this is not a unique thing, but I think we're in a time now when that can be so honored and highlighted. So that would be why I think we're so important.
That's perfect. I'm going to remember that one. Thank you. Sadie, why are Native youth so important?
Ivy and Rosalie, you guys are so inspiring. I really love everything that you have to say. I think every time that I go on mute and I just hear you, it's just amazing to listen to you. And I think it's just one of those good feelings when you see an Indigenous person and they're thriving, or they're able to have the platform to speak about something. It's so inspiring to me to keep going, because I just feel like it's like with my cousin, if I didn't have her, I don't know if I could do it. And it's like when I have you guys and when I have people next to me that I can share, even in this time where we're virtual because of the pandemic, it's just inspiring, and it helps refill my cup a little bit when I've emptied it. And it helps just nourish me in so many ways, and it helps nourish the elders that I work with as well. And that's something that I really care about, to see our elders happy and smiling and knowing that their ancestors' power and wisdom is passed on through them into us. And I just really appreciate you saying that, Ivy, because we do have the power of our ancestors behind us, and they're always standing there helping us to continue forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, speaking of the 7 generations and just the embodiment of that, you all here embody that. We have a question from the comments, back to you, Sadie. And that's, could you tell us a little bit more about the ban on native reef fishing and whether that's been restored?
So the reef net was banned on both sides of the borders. So in Canada, they have the Natural History Museum, and the 3rd floor was based specifically for Native history. And that there was a huge proclamation from, I believe, 1877 that shared how Native Americans are not allowed to reef net. They're not allowed to gather in their longhouses. And if they see any Native person gathering in their longhouses or using the reef net, then they will be fined like a large amount of money at that time and banned from that place. And then on this side of the border, which is an imaginary border, there's really no border in the water. Like, we're saltwater salmon people, and there's no line dividing us. We see each other and we're like, oh, hey, cuz. But anyways, we were reef net fishermen here, I believe a little bit longer than in Canada, because my grandpa was a reef net fisherman in the 1900s, in 1950, I believe. And they reef netted for quite a while. And he has records of reef netting in Multnomah Bay. But so every night they kept their reef net out, and the non-native people would come over and observe the reef net. And there's record that my grandpa, he was like, oh, well, just let him look. Like, that was his reaction to it. He's like, just let him look. And so then they went around and they observed the reef net so heavily, and at that time the non-natives were using fish traps. So they wanted to learn the reef net because they noticed that the natives were getting so much salmon, and the largest salmon. And that's a factor of the reef net, is that it has a hole. So then the small salmon are allowed to go through, and that hole is what makes it the shkola. And it allows the babies, the women fish to go through. And so then after the non-natives figured it out, it took them 10 years to observe the reef net and then put it into their own functions. And they ended up taking out they took the part that makes this sustainable, the part of the reef net that makes it produce the most high quality salmon. And they made them so commercialized that they have these, I've been on one, actually, a commercial reef net, and it's like not canoes, they're like platforms, and they're on buoys, so they rise above the water, and then the net goes in the center. And then to see the salmon, there's these huge, like, lifeguard, like you walk up the lifeguard thing and then like sit on the chair at the top, like that's what it looks like. So there's 2 of them, and they rise up, and at the end of it. And the non-native peoples, once they figured out the reef net technology, which was very complex. They took over all of the reef net sites and said natives are not allowed to reef net here. And if they do, well, we'll find them and we'll kick them off this land or off this water. And that's that, that's the policy, and people are going to support us. The fish cops are going to support us. And if you have to go to jail for 5 to 15 days, then so be it. That's just the way that it is. And then the first time a reef net has been in the water since that time was when we did the Spirit of Shwala coalition, which was really interesting because my dad, I love this story of my dad. He had a spiritual connection because his dad was a reef net fisherman, and my dad's a gill net fisherman, and he fishes the river with a gill net, which is common. There's different types around here. Purse-seiners, which are huge nets that you have to wrap on coils, like really large barrel, like even larger than barrel sized, like coils. And then all the net comes in from the water and it just like wraps onto it. And those are basically like what I see as large. People would say otherwise. And my dad, he went to the Northwest Indian College and the fish commissions, and he was saying, well, why don't we use the reef net? Why is the reef net not used around here? And they didn't really give him an answer. So then him and my mom went on this like wild goose hunt to go figure out who else reef nets in the region. And he ended up over at University of Victoria, and my uncle, Nick Claxton, he was doing reef net revitalization from his treaty in his region, which was to fishes formerly. So there's labels, there's words in the treaty that says you're able to fish as formerly. And people learn about the reef net. And my dad ended up getting the honor of helping him create a reef net. And then they used that at Tlatelolco, which is the photos that I showed you in the beginning when my dad got named Sahanap Hasmin. And then we found out after that we're all cousins, and those are my uncles because they share the name Sahanap. Adam Olsen, he's the Green Party representative for Canada, and he shares the same name as my dad, which is Sahanap. And we learned a lot of place names since we've connected back to our family, and we've learned a lot of reef net sites and different knowledge about the salmon. So it's really exciting to be a part of that revitalization process. And then there's also another commercial reef net fisher around here that opened up after the Spirit of the Shwala events.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that and just that intimate knowledge with all of us. I encourage everybody to, do a little more research and see them. Those old pictures and this amazing work that you guys are doing is Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous science. No one can't, not tell you that. It holds up to Western science. So thank you. As we're, coming up at, the half hour and closing this, I want to just go around with all the panelists and just give some closing words. And then how can we find you guys and, support the work that you're doing? Please put that stuff in the chat if you'd like. We'd love to, follow your journey from outside this. Ivy, would you like to go first?
Yes, I would. I don't have any official social media. It's just personal, but feel free to check out my LinkedIn. I'm trying to grow that platform. All I would say is continue to listen to Native youth and contextualize us in these big, great systems and spaces. When you have Native youth in your presence, honor them and honor their knowledge. It's not just of them, but their ancestors and their families and their history. Manahovu to all of you, and thank you so much. To follow me, yeah, my name is Ivy Pete. If you look that up, I'm sure you'll be able to find something. I'll drop my email in the chat if you'd like to speak more, but thank you so much.
Rosalie, could you go next?
Yeah. I'd just like to thank everybody who attended once again for putting in this effort to be aware of how we can uplift and empower Indigenous youth. And that Indigenous youth, more than anything, I think need to feel validated and need to feel valued. And so even though a lot of us, we have trauma, but even more so, we need to be acknowledged by our resilience. With that being said, my name's Rosalie Fish. The social media that I'm best at is the Instagram. And if you just look up Rosalie Fish or Rosalie Fish with an X at the end, I'm usually around there. Thank you.
And Sadie.
We have a couple different social medias. So there's the White Swan Environmental Facebook, which is we, capital W, capital E, hyphen one mind for the purpose of the work. There's also another one growing called Keepers of the Tradition, Protectors of the Circle of Life, which follows back to the youth activities that we did for the first Spirit of the Shwala Coalition development in 2016. And that's a really interesting page. It's been growing. We don't have an Instagram yet for we, but I do have a personal. It's Sadie.Olsen2 because I lost my password to my other ones. And feel free to follow me. I think I'm on public right now, but sometimes I switch between public and private. And also my LinkedIn. I have a LinkedIn. I don't even know how to use it, but you just reminded me, Ivy, that I should try to build that because that's just a cool connective site. And then I'll link my Gmail and the chat. It's just sadie.olsen.we@gmail.com. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for attending this week's Civic boot camp through just kind of learning about the Salish Sea and region. It's kind of amazing listening to these youth, Indigenous excellence and success kind of speak about their own values and communities. I just want to let you guys know that next week on the 18th, we're having another one, Weaving Social Responsibilities with Native Values. That's Friday, June 18th at 12 p.m. Pacific time. We'll be talking with Bill Kalapa, Polly Olsen, and Alyssa Macy. And we just want to thank you all for attending this and really prioritizing Native youth to the fullest. This is just the beginning of their journey, so we can't wait to see what they'll do. And again, Haishka, Masi, thank you all for coming here and thank you for sharing your stories.
Thank you, Owen and Sadie and Ivy and Rosalie and Rena for sharing your wisdom, your stories, your insights, your perspectives. Really appreciate it. And again, please join us next week for the Weaving Social Responsibility with Native Values, our last webinar. And we have to also thank our sponsor, Civic Bootcamp sponsor, Alaska Airlines. So thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Owen, especially for your excellent moderating, and congratulations again on graduating today. So everyone, please take care, stay safe.